There are moments when reality becomes more disturbing than anything Hollywood could create. A young man disappears, a complicated love triangle turns into jealousy and violence, and a disturbing idea from a horror movie becomes the blueprint for a real murder. Welcome to Docket Unsealed, where we uncover the details behind some of the most disturbing criminal cases, examine the evidence, and follow the stories that made headlines. Today, we're going to Great Yarmouth, Norfolk, to revisit the shocking murder of 17-year-old Simon Everitt. And what makes this case especially disturbing is that, according to the evidence presented at trial, the idea behind Simon's murder may have been inspired by a horror film. The Warning Sign. A year before Simon Everitt disappeared, Jonathan Clark was watching the horror movie Severance with a friend. During one particularly disturbing scene, a man is killed after being covered in petrol and set on fire. Clark reportedly turned to his friend and made a chilling comment, wondering how wicked it would be if something like that could actually be done to someone in real life. At the time, it might have sounded like nothing more than a sick joke, but investigators would later argue that it was anything but, because eventually, Clark would be accused of using an almost identical method against someone he considered a romantic rival. Simon disappears. On June 7, 2008, 17-year-old Simon Everitt disappeared. Simon was studying engineering at Yarmouth College and had been living in Great Yarmouth after moving there with his father in 2004. He was described by his family as a typical teenager who loved music, entertainment, Manchester United, and life itself. He had recently moved out of the family home and into a bedsit near the seafront. That night, Simon was riding his mountain bike near the hospital in Gorleston. It was around 10:30 p.m., and that was the last time anyone would see him alive. At first, Norfolk police treated the case as a missing person investigation. But 8 days later, everything changed. Information provided by a member of the public caused detectives to reconsider the case. This was no longer simply a disappearance. Police now suspected that Simon had been murdered. The body is found. On June 28th, investigators made the discovery everyone had been hoping they wouldn't have to make. Simon Everitt's body was found concealed beneath soil in a ditch in the Morty area, roughly 6 miles northwest of Great Yarmouth. He was only 17 years old. Police also located Simon's bicycle in Courton, not far from where he had last been seen. Detectives believed he had been assaulted and killed shortly after disappearing. But the question remained, who had wanted Simon dead, and why? The answer would lead investigators into a complicated relationship between 4 people. The love triangle. Simon had been involved with 19-year-old Fiona Liam, but he wasn't the only man connected to her. Jonathan Clark and Jimmy Lee Stewart had also been involved in relationships with Fiona, and as detectives began reconstructing the events leading up to Simon's disappearance, Fiona's relationships appeared to become increasingly important. Fiona had previously been married and had a child. After separating from her husband in 2007, she began a relationship with Jonathan Clark, but that relationship ended in November. Fiona then began seeing Simon. The relationship became serious very quickly. By Valentine's Day 2008, Simon had proposed marriage. Fiona accepted. But incredibly, within a week, the engagement was over. Fiona then began a relationship with Jimmy Lee Stewart. The relationships kept changing, but the jealousy surrounding them would soon become deadly. The first attack. On June 6th, one day before Simon disappeared, Simon, Jonathan Clark, and Maria Chandela met in a local park. The purpose was apparently to settle the dispute surrounding Fiona. Instead, Clark attacked Simon. He punched and kicked the teenager in what was described as a vicious beating. Simon was frightened enough to report the incident to police. He had every reason to believe that Clark posed a threat to him. But the following day, things became even more complicated. June 7th was the final day Simon would ever be seen alive. The final night. Fiona ended her relationship with Jimmy Lee Stewart by text message. She wanted to return to Simon. She reportedly told police that she didn't love Jimmy, she loved Simon. That afternoon, Fiona spent time with Simon and Stewart. Later, she returned to her flat. Simon had initially planned to join them, but he became ill. Then, something happened that would later become one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. Fiona tried to contact Simon. There was no answer. She called Stewart. Someone answered the phone, but nobody spoke. Instead, Fiona heard traffic. She heard a thumping sound, and then she heard Simon shouting for Jimmy to help him. The call ended. Stewart later claimed he couldn't remember the conversation because he had been suffering from concussion. Fiona became concerned and reported Simon missing. Stewart accompanied her to the police station, but according to the account presented in the case, within days, Stewart convinced Fiona that Simon had simply returned to the north of England and wasn't coming back. And then something happened that would begin to unravel the entire case. The confession. Stewart eventually broke down. One night, he confessed to his mother. He told her what had happened to Simon. According to his account, Simon had been lured to a lay-by near Courton under the pretense that he was going to meet a woman. Instead, Simon was attacked. He was forced into the boot of Maria Shandella's car. The group then drove toward the woods at Morty. What happened there was horrific. Simon was restrained and petrol was used against him. He was eventually set on fire. He died in the woods. The details were so disturbing that Stewart's mother knew she couldn't keep the confession to herself. She made the painful decision to report her own son. She later explained that Stewart had gone through the entire story while crying, and she believed he simply couldn't live with what had happened. Another witness comes forward. Maria Shandella also eventually went to police. She claimed that Clark and Stewart had pressured her into using her car to transport Simon. She maintained that she didn't know the real purpose of the plan. Shandella later directed investigators to locations connected to the crime, including the area where the car had been parked and the place where Simon's bicycle had been abandoned. The investigation was now building a picture of what had happened, but one major question remained: was Simon's murder planned? The evidence against Clark. When Jonathan Clark was arrested, he denied involvement in Simon's murder. He admitted attacking Simon in the park the day before the disappearance, but he claimed that after that assault, his dispute with Simon was finished. Clark told police that on the night Simon disappeared, he had actually gone to the beach alone. He claimed he stayed there until around 4 a.m., but investigators didn't believe his story. Several people reportedly told police that Clark had been boasting about being involved in a murder. Even more damaging was evidence involving his own family. Clark's younger sister eventually gave evidence against him. Then, investigators examined CCTV footage. The footage showed Clark, Stewart, and Shandella at a petrol station shortly before Simon's abduction. They were filling a petrol can. For prosecutors, this was powerful evidence. It suggested that what happened to Simon wasn't an accident. It had been planned. The trial. At Norwich Crown Court, Jonathan Clark, Jimmy Lee Stewart, and Maria Shandella all denied murder. The prosecution argued that the evidence demonstrated the extraordinary brutality inflicted upon Simon. The complicated relationships with Fiona were placed before the jury, and the court was shown the scene from Severance that had become so significant to the prosecution's case. Clark admitted he may have made the earlier comment about the movie, but he claimed he had only said it as a joke. He denied being responsible for Simon's death, yet some of his own statements during the trial did little to help him. Maria Shandella told the court that she had been instructed to drive to the petrol station. She said she questioned why they needed petrol, but was told to be quiet. She maintained that she didn't know what the petrol would eventually be used for. She also described threats made against her after the murder. Jimmy Lee Stewart gave his own account. He claimed that he had gone along with the plan, intending only to frighten Simon. According to his testimony, it was Clark who ultimately threw the match, but the jury rejected their defenses. The verdict. All three defendants were found guilty of murder. Jonathan Clark was sentenced to 27 years in prison. Jimmy Lee Stewart received 22 years. Maria Chandela was sentenced to 17 years before being considered for parole. The judge said the three had attempted to cover their tracks and mislead investigators, but the plan eventually collapsed, and according to the judge, one of the biggest reasons was Jonathan Clark himself. He had allegedly boasted about what he had done. The very thing that may have been intended to keep the murder hidden ultimately helped expose it. Simon's family. For Simon's family, the verdict could never undo what had happened. His father, Vince, spoke about the devastating impact of his son's murder on the family. His parents suffered both mentally and physically. His younger brothers struggled to understand how something so horrific could happen. Simon had been only 17. He had plans. He had ambitions. He loved music, football, entertainment, and life. His stepmother described him as someone who lived life fully and never wanted to waste a moment. His family believed he had done nothing wrong, except, in their words, fall in love with the wrong person. A disturbing end to the trial. Even after being convicted, the behavior of the defendants continued to shock people in the courtroom. During sentencing, Clark and Stewart reportedly smirked and whispered to one another while the judge spoke. And as Stewart was being taken away, he reportedly made a V sign toward the public gallery. For Simon's family, it was another painful reminder of the lack of remorse they believed they had witnessed. The final question. There is something particularly disturbing about this case. A teenage boy disappeared after becoming caught in a web of jealousy and relationships. A simple argument became violence. Violence became a plan. And a disturbing idea from a horror movie allegedly crossed the boundary between fiction and reality. Simon Everitt was only 17 years old. His life should have continued for decades. Instead, it ended in a horrifying act of violence that shocked Norfolk and left his family devastated. As the lead detective said after the trial, this was the kind of crime people might expect to see only in films. But reality sometimes can be far worse than fiction. This has been Docket Unsealed. If you want more carefully researched true crime stories, disturbing cases, courtroom evidence, and investigations that reveal what really happened behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe to Docket Unsealed. And remember, every case leaves a record. Every record has a story. And sometimes the truth is buried inside the docket. Thanks for watching.